They were born on the same day, at the same moment, sharing every fragment of DNA. 4 identical girls who should have had mirrored lives and parallel futures. But what happened to the Ginian quadruplets defied everything science believed it knew about the human mind and mental illness. One by one, all 4 sisters succumbed to schizophrenia. To curious neighbors in a small Midwestern American town in the 1930s, they were just 4 adorable, identical little girls dressed in matching outfits. But inside that seemingly normal house, unseen forces were shaping tragic destinies. This case would become one of the most important psychiatric studies of the 20th century. The Ginian quadruplets helped answer one of science's oldest questions. What shapes us more, our genes or our environment? The answer they revealed changed psychiatry forever and continues to influence medicine to this day. Join us as we unravel the extraordinary and disturbing story of the Ginian quadruplets. A story of 4 genetically identical girls, a home marked by dark secrets, and a natural experiment that science could never have planned. This is a journey through madness, trauma, and the mystery of the human mind. Prepare to learn about the case that proved that not even identical genes can guarantee the same fate. It was an ordinary afternoon in May 1930 when the impossible happened in a small maternity ward in the heart of America. A young mother, after hours of difficult labor, gave birth not to 1, not to 2, but to 4 identical girls. The medical staff were stunned. The chances of identical quadruplets occurring naturally were astronomical, approximately 1 in 15 million births. The babies looked so alike that even the doctors had difficulty telling them apart. They were weighed, measured, and thoroughly examined. Each was born weighing approximately 2 kilograms, small but healthy. The event was extraordinary enough to attract the attention of the local press. Journalists visited the hospital, photographs were taken, and for a few days, the family found themselves in the spotlight. The parents, whom researchers would later identify with the pseudonym Genain, a word derived from Greek meaning terrible birth, initially viewed the quadruplets as a divine blessing. Mr. Genain, a man of average height with piercing eyes and controlling mannerisms, publicly declared that his daughters were a gift from God. Mrs. Genain, a shy and submissive woman, simply smiled nervously for the cameras, holding 2 of the babies, while nurses held the other 2. The girls were given the names Nora, Iris, Myra, and Hester, also pseudonyms created by the researchers to protect their identities. These names were assigned in order of birth, with Nora being the first to arrive in the world, followed by Iris minutes later, then Myra, and finally Hester. This birth order, although separated by only minutes, would become significant in the following decades. In the first few months, the quadruplets seemed to thrive as much as premature babies could. They developed at similar rates, reaching developmental milestones almost simultaneously. When one smiled, the others soon followed. When one cried, often all 4 would start crying in a disconcerting chorus that left their mother exhausted. As the quadruplets grew older, their uniqueness continued to attract attention. Mr. Genain, initially proud of their notoriety, began to develop an increasingly possessive attitude toward his daughters. He saw the girls not as individuals, but as a group, a curiosity that belonged exclusively to him. This sense of ownership would soon transform into something far more sinister. The Genain family home was modest but well maintained, located on a quiet street where all the houses seemed almost identical. From the outside, everything appeared normal. But within those walls, an atmosphere of oppressive control was forming. Mr. Genain had established strict rules for his daughters from a very young age. They were not allowed to play with other neighborhood children without direct supervision. Visits to the house were rare and carefully monitored. The 4 girls shared not only identical appearances, but also a room, clothes, toys, everything. Mr. Genain insisted they dress identically every day. He personally chose their clothes each morning, often entering their room while they were changing, invading the privacy that growing girls would naturally desire. Mrs. Genain rarely interfered, having learned early in her marriage that questioning her husband resulted in outbursts of anger. At school, the quadruplets were a constant attraction. Teachers and classmates were fascinated by their perfect resemblance. But this attention came at a price. The girls were rarely seen as individuals. They were always the quadruplets, never Nora, Iris, Myra, or Hester individually. This lack of individual identity began to weigh on them in ways that no one at the time recognized. At home, they developed their own language, not completely incomprehensible to adults, but full of coded words, inside jokes, and references that only they understood. Psychologists would later identify this as cryptophagia, a relatively common phenomenon in twins, but amplified in the case of quadruplets. It was their way of creating a private space, a mental refuge where their father's suffocating control could not fully reach them. But not even this secret language could protect them from what was to come. The atmosphere at home was becoming increasingly toxic. Mr. Genain was not violent in the conventional sense. He rarely yelled at or hit his daughters. His control was more insidious, more psychological, and therefore more devastating. He operated through constant surveillance, emotional manipulation, an invasion of privacy that bordered on, and possibly crossed, lines of sexual abuse. As the girls entered puberty, Mr. Genain's behavior became even more disturbing. He insisted on supervising their baths until an inappropriately advanced age. He made comments about their developing bodies in ways that made them uncomfortable. He forbade them from having any contact with boys at school, interpreting even innocent conversations as promiscuous behavior that needed to be punished. Mrs. Janan, trapped in her own unhappy marriage, was unable to protect her daughters. She had grown up in a time and culture where challenging one's husband was simply not a considered option. Furthermore, she herself carried traumas from her own childhood, traumas that left her emotionally distant and unable to provide the maternal support her daughters desperately needed. Later, psychiatric records would suggest that the abuse may have gone beyond the psychological. Therapists' notes vaguely mention inappropriate behavior of a sexual nature on the part of the father, although the specific details remain unclear in the files. What is documented is that all 4 girls developed severe anxiety related to their father, particularly in situations involving physical privacy. The quadruplets' isolation was almost complete. They were allowed to attend school, but extracurricular activities were forbidden. Classmates' birthday parties? Denied. After-school sports? Impossible. Even phone conversations were monitored, with Mr. Janan often listening on another extension. The girls learned never to discuss their home life with strangers, not because it was explicitly forbidden, but because they intuitively felt that doing so would bring terrible consequences. Neighbors occasionally commented that the quadruplets seemed strange or very quiet, but in 1940s America, people generally didn't interfere in other families' affairs. What happened inside the Janan house stayed inside the Janan house. And inside that house, 4 identical girls were being shaped by forces that would eventually break their minds in ways that genes alone could never explain. Nora was the first to show signs that something was deeply wrong. At 15, she began to withdraw even further than the isolation already imposed by her family allowed. She would spend hours sitting in silence, staring into nothingness, her eyes glazed and distant. When she spoke, her sentences occasionally didn't make complete sense, disconnected thoughts that jumped from one topic to another without apparent logic. At first, her parents and sisters attributed it to typical adolescence, but the behavior intensified. Nora began laughing at completely inappropriate times, during serious conversations or for no apparent reason. She also developed strange facial expressions, grimaces that seemed involuntary. At school, her teachers noticed that her previously solid academic performance was rapidly declining. Iris was next, approximately 6 months later. Her symptoms were different, more dramatic. She began hearing voices, whispers initially, and full conversations with entities that no one else could perceive. These voices commented on her actions, criticized her choices, sometimes gave commands. Iris tried to hide this from her family at first, fearing they would think she was crazy. But eventually the voices became so intrusive that she could no longer disguise them. One afternoon, Mrs. Janan found Iris in her room, having an animated conversation with the empty corner. When questioned, Iris calmly explained that she was talking to the television men who were sending her special messages through the programming. She believed that news anchors were communicating directly with her, providing coded instructions on how to behave. Myra developed symptoms that were perhaps the most visually disturbing. She alternated between states of complete catatonia, where she would remain absolutely motionless for hours, not even blinking, and episodes of extreme agitation where she would move frantically around the room, repeatedly rearranging objects into patterns that only made sense to her. Her eyes had a frighteningly empty quality during these episodes, as if she were looking through walls into some realm that no one else could access. Hester, the youngest of the 4, began showing symptoms at age 17. Her schizophrenia manifested primarily as severe paranoia. She developed elaborate delusional beliefs about conspiracies directed against her and her sisters. She believed that neighbors were poisoning her food, that the government was monitoring her thoughts through hidden devices, and that her own family might be involved in a plot to harm her. In 1952, when they were all 22 years old, the inevitable happened. All 4 sisters had been diagnosed with schizophrenia by local psychiatrists. For a medical community already fascinated by their rarity as identical quadruplets, this represented something unprecedented in the history of psychiatry. The news of 4 genetically identical sisters, all diagnosed with schizophrenia, spread rapidly through medical and academic networks. In 1954, Dr. David Rosenthal, a prominent researcher at the National Institute of Mental Health, NIMH, learned of the case. He immediately recognized its extraordinary significance. This was the perfect natural experiment that geneticists and psychiatrists had been waiting for decades. At the time, psychiatry was deeply divided over the origins of schizophrenia. One camp firmly believed the illness was purely genetic. You were born with it, or you weren't. Another camp argued that environmental factors, particularly parenting style, were the main culprits. This division wasn't merely academic. It determined how patients were treated and how families were advised. The dominant theory in the 1950s blamed mothers. The concept of the schizophrenogenic mother, a cold, rejecting, and emotionally disturbed mother who literally caused schizophrenia in her children through psychological abuse, was widely accepted. Countless mothers had been blamed, stigmatized, and traumatized by this cruel and, as it later turned out, completely false theory. The Jinin quadruplets offered a unique opportunity to settle this debate once and for all. If schizophrenia were purely genetic, 4 sisters with identical DNA should develop the disease identically. Same age of onset, same symptoms, same progression, same severity. If the environment were the deciding factor, then differences in their individual experiences should produce significant variations in how the disease manifested. Dr. Rosenthal contacted the Jinin family, explaining the scientific importance of their case. He proposed bringing the 4 sisters to the NIMH in Bethesda, Maryland, where they could receive cutting-edge treatment while being intensively studied. For the parents, especially Mrs. Jinin, who still carried the internalized guilt of theories that blamed the mothers, the prospect that science could prove a biological origin was appealing. In 1955, the quadruplets arrived at the NIMH. The institution was considered the best in the country for psychiatric research. The sisters were housed in a special wing, where they would spend the next 3 years undergoing an exhaustive battery of tests and evaluations. Every aspect of their lives was meticulously documented. Their sleep patterns, their social interactions, their responses to medications, their detailed life histories. Psychologists conducted hundreds of hours of individual and group interviews. Neurologists performed extensive physical examinations. Psychiatrists observed his behavior in different contexts. Every nuance, every symptom, every moment of lucidity or confusion was recorded, analyzed, and filed. The results of the first years of study were simultaneously enlightening and perplexing. It was confirmed that the 4 were indeed genetically identical, monozygotic quadruplets who shared 100% of their DNA. However, their manifestations of schizophrenia were dramatically different in severity and specific characteristics. Nora, the eldest by a few crucial minutes, presented the mildest form of the illness. Although definitely schizophrenic, she maintained relatively long periods of lucidity. She was able to hold coherent conversations most of the time, take care of her basic hygiene needs, and even perform simple tasks. Her symptoms were predominantly negative: emotional blunting, social withdrawal, occasional disorganized thinking, rather than the more dramatic, positive symptoms, such as hallucinations and delusions. Iris occupied a troubling middle ground. She experienced frequent auditory hallucinations and maintained elaborate delusional systems, complex false beliefs about her identity and purpose in the world. She believed she had special powers, that she was destined for an important mission that would be revealed to her. However, unlike many severely schizophrenic patients, Iris occasionally demonstrated insight into her condition. During her moments of clarity, she could discuss her hallucinations and acknowledge that they were not real, an ability that deeply intrigued researchers. Myra suffered from the most severe and debilitating form of schizophrenia among the 4. She spent long periods in catatonic states, completely disconnected from reality. When not catatonic, she exhibited bizarre and unpredictable behavior. She needed constant supervision and assistance with virtually all daily activities. Her delusions were fragmented and terrifying. She often seemed to be in a perpetual state of terror, reacting to threats that existed only in her disturbed mind. Hester was somewhere between Iris and Myra in terms of severity. Her paranoia was the dominant symptom, creating a deep distrust of virtually everyone around her, including her own sisters and the doctors who tried to help her. This distrust made treatment extremely difficult. She frequently refused medication, convinced it was poison. She alternated between periods of relative stability, where she could function reasonably well, and profound episodes of acute psychosis. The crucial discovery was this: 4 women with identical genetics were experiencing the same illness in 4 markedly different ways. Genetics clearly played a role. All 4 developed schizophrenia after all. But identical genes did not result in identical illnesses. Something else was at work, something that transformed the same genetic potential into very different clinical realities. The researchers began to meticulously examine each sister's individual life experiences, searching for clues that could explain these differences. What they would discover would fundamentally change psychiatry's understanding of nature versus nurture. As researchers delved deeper into the individual histories of the quadruplets, patterns began to emerge that correlated strongly with the severity of their symptoms. Each sister, though raised in the same home by the same parents, had had subtly but significantly different experiences. And these differences seemed to have shaped how their shared genetic vulnerability manifested. Nora, whose schizophrenia was the mildest, had received slightly preferential treatment in the first months of her life. As the firstborn, even if only by minutes, she received more individual attention from her mother during the crucial period of bonding. She was also, for reasons the family never fully explained, less the target of her father's controlling obsession. Perhaps because she was the firstborn, she established a somewhat stronger sense of self before the oppressive environment completely solidified. Iris, with her mild symptoms but occasional insight, had developed more elaborate coping strategies during childhood. She was the most verbally skilled of the 4 and had used this ability to create narratives that made sense of her confused world. Her delusions, though clearly psychotic, had an almost protective quality. They transformed her from a helpless victim into someone with a special purpose and powers. This ability to create meaning, even if distorted, seemed to offer some protection against complete disintegration. Myra's case was the most tragic and revealing. Through careful interviews and family records, researchers discovered that she had been her father's favorite in deeply disturbing ways. She received the most inappropriate and invasive attention. She was more closely watched, more controlled, more sexualized. The trauma that all the sisters experienced was more intense and prolonged for Myra. It was no coincidence that she developed the most severe form of the illness. Hester, with her pervasive paranoia, had been the most severely punished of the four during childhood. Minor transgressions were met with disproportionate disapproval. She had learned to see the world as fundamentally threatening because, in her experience, it was. Her psychotic paranoia was, in a sense, an extreme extension of an adaptation that had been useful in her childhood, always being alert to danger, never fully trusting anyone. The researchers also discovered differences in each sister's social support networks. Nora had cultivated a close friendship with a cousin during adolescence, one of the few external connections her father allowed. This single support relationship seemed to have provided a buffer against the worst of the family stress. Myra, in contrast, never developed such connections, leaving her completely isolated apart from her equally traumatized sisters. The revelation was revolutionary. Schizophrenia was neither simply genetic nor simply environmental. It was a complex interaction between genetic vulnerability and lived experience. Identical genes provided the same potential for disease, but the environment determined how that potential was expressed. Two people with the same genetic makeup could have radically different outcomes depending on their experiences, especially during critical periods of development. This discovery had profound implications not only for schizophrenia, but for the entire understanding of their relationship between nature and nurture in human health. During the decades that followed, the Genean quadruplets experienced virtually every treatment that psychiatry had to offer. In the 1950s and early 1960s, this included some of the most controversial and, in retrospect, questionable interventions in medical history. Their experiences reflected both the advances and the tragic errors of 20th century psychiatry. First-generation antipsychotic medications, also known as neuroleptics, were introduced in the mid-1950s. Drugs, such as chlorpromazine, thorazine, and haldol, represented the first real pharmacological treatments for schizophrenia. Quadruples were put into several of these medications in different combinations and dosages. The results were mixed at best. For Nora, whose illness was milder, antipsychotics seemed to offer some benefit. Her periods of disorganized thinking became less frequent, although they never disappeared completely. However, she developed significant side effects: Parkinsonian tremors, substantial weight gain, and a lethargy that she described as feeling dead inside. It was a cruel trade-off, partial reduction of psychotic symptoms in exchange for a drastically diminished quality of life. Iris had a complicated relationship with medication. During periods of relative stability, she often refused to take her medication, insisting that she didn't need it or that it was interfering with her special mission. When she was in acute crisis, the medications helped reduce her most terrifying hallucinations, but she hated how they made her feel numb, disconnected, no longer herself. It was a common dilemma. The treatments that alleviated her worst symptoms also seemed to rob her of something essential to her personality. For Myra, no medication seemed to make a significant difference. She was put on ever-increasing doses of multiple antipsychotics, sometimes taking 3 or 4 different medications simultaneously. The side effects were devastating. She developed tardive dyskinesia, an irreversible movement disorder characterized by involuntary movements of the face and tongue, but her psychotic symptoms remained largely intractable. She continued to alternate between catatonia and agitation, lost in a world that no one else could reach. Hester exhibited what doctors called non-adherence to treatment. Her paranoia made her deeply distrustful of doctors and medications. She believed the drugs were part of a conspiracy to control or harm her. She frequently hid pills in her cheek and spat them out when no one was looking. When forced to take long-term injections, she became even more paranoid and hostile, seeing it as confirmation of her delusional beliefs. In addition to medication, the quadruplets underwent electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, popularly known as shock therapy. This treatment, which involves passing an electric current through the brain to induce a therapeutic seizure, was widely used in the 1950s for severe psychiatric conditions. All 4 sisters received series of ECT treatments at various points. The results were, again, variable and temporary. Some reported short-term improvement in depressive symptoms that often accompanied their schizophrenia, but all experienced significant memory loss, a common and distressing side effect of ECT. Years of memories, already fragmented by the illness, were further erased by the treatments that were supposed to help. The study of the Genean quadruplets, which spanned more than 4 decades, yielded insights that fundamentally transformed psychiatry's understanding of mental illness. Their lives, though marked by suffering, contributed to advancements that have benefited millions of people worldwide. The case continues to be cited in medical textbooks and studied by new generations of researchers to this day. The most significant contribution was the definitive establishment of the biopsychosocial model of mental illness. Before Genean's quadruples, psychiatry was stuck in an unproductive debate between extremes. genes versus environment, nature versus nurture. The quadruples irrefutably proved that this was a false dichotomy. Mental illness is not caused by genes or environment. It is caused by the complex interaction between both. This insight fundamentally changed how patients were treated. It was no longer acceptable to blame families, especially mothers, for their children's mental illness. The cruel theory of the schizophrenogenic mother was finally discarded, although the damage it caused to countless families had already been done. At the same time, the case demonstrated that purely biological treatment, medication alone, was insufficient. The environment, the trauma, the social support, all mattered profoundly. The case of the quadruplets also advanced our understanding of epigenetics even before the term was widely used. Epigenetics refers to changes in gene expression that do not involve alterations in the underlying DNA sequence. Essentially, the environment can turn on or turn off certain genes or adjust their volume. The quadruplets demonstrated this perfectly. They had the same genes, but different experiments altered how those genes were expressed. Subsequent research has identified specific mechanisms by which trauma and stress can affect gene expression. For example, severe childhood trauma can alter DNA methylation, a key process in epigenetics, in genes related to stress response and brain function. These changes can persist throughout life and even be passed on to the next generation. The Genane quadruples provided real-world evidence for these processes before molecular biology could explain them at the cellular level. The case also had implications for prevention and early intervention. If the environment can significantly modify how genetic vulnerabilities are expressed, then environmental interventions can potentially prevent or mitigate diseases. Modern programs focused on reducing childhood trauma, providing early intervention for at-risk children, and supporting families under stress owe part of their scientific justification to the Genane case. For the schizophrenia research community specifically, the quadruple studies demonstrated the importance of studying not only the presence or absence of the disease, but also its heterogeneity, the fact that schizophrenia presents very differently in different people. This realization led to efforts to subdivide schizophrenia into more specific subtypes, and eventually to a shift towards personalized medicine, where treatments are tailored to each patient's specific profile. Dr. Rosenthal and his team published extensively on quadruplets over decades. Their papers are cited thousands of times in the scientific literature. The case became one of the most influential studies in the history of genetic psychiatry. But this scientific legacy came at an immense human cost. All four Genane sisters have passed away. Nora lived to be 82, spending her final decades in a long-term care facility. Iris died at 76, still retaining some of her characteristic delusions until the end. Myra, whose illness was the most severe, died at 73, having spent the vast majority of her adult life hospitalized or in institutional care. Hester lived to be 80, her paranoia lessening somewhat in old age but never disappearing completely. None of the four married or had children. Their lives were largely consumed by the disease and the scientific studies that documented it in exhaustive detail. This fact raises profound ethical questions that continue to be debated today. Were the quadruplets helped or exploited by the scientific community that studied them so intensively? On the one hand, they received access to some of the best psychiatric care available at the time, care that their families could not have otherwise afforded. They were treated by some of the leading specialists in the country. Their basic needs were met. They were not abandoned or neglected as so many psychiatric patients of that era were. On the other hand, much of their lives was spent being observed, tested, interviewed, and documented. They had minimal privacy. Their most intimate experiences, their moments of greatest vulnerability, were recorded in clinical records that were then analyzed by countless researchers. They were, in a sense, transformed from people into scientific specimens. Their real identities were erased by pseudonyms, their lives reduced to data. The issue of consent is particularly problematic. People with severe schizophrenia often have a compromised capacity to provide truly informed consent. They may not fully understand what they are agreeing to, or their illness may affect their judgment. In the case of the quadruplets, consent was initially given by their parents, and then presumably by the sisters themselves. But how meaningful was this consent for women who were frequently in psychotic states? Modern ethical standards for research involving vulnerable populations are far more rigorous than they were in the 1950s and 1960s. Today, studies like the Genane quadruplet study would face much greater ethical scrutiny. There would be oversight from institutional review boards, ongoing monitoring of consent, and greater protection of participant privacy. Whether this would have prevented the valuable insights gained from the quadruplet study is an open question. Still, it would be naive and wrong to deny the immense value of the knowledge gained from their lives. The quadruplets helped free countless mothers from the cruel guilt imposed by the schizophrenogenic mother theory. They helped establish that prevention and early intervention are possible and important. They demonstrated that even profound genetic vulnerabilities are not absolute destiny. The family never sought publicity. The pseudonym Genane protected their real identity. And unlike some other families affected by mental illness who later became public figures, the Genane family remained anonymous. This was probably for the best for the sisters, but it also means that their contributions are less publicly recognized than they could have been. Today, we advocate for more humane and holistic approaches to mental illness, treatments that see patients as whole people, not just as symptom bearers. We advocate for trauma-informed medicine, for personalized medicine, for understanding each individual in their complete context. These approaches were made possible in part by what we learned from the Genin quadruplets. Their lives were tragic. They were marked by suffering that no one should have to endure. But from these difficult lives, knowledge grew that fundamentally changed how we understand the human mind. The Genin quadruplets deserve to be remembered not only as research subjects, but as individuals whose existence, however painful, shed light on one of the deepest mysteries of medical science: how we become who we are. 4 girls, identical genes, divergent destinies. The Genin quadruplets were born at an impossible moment of statistical rarity. They lived lives that no one would choose, and through their suffering, they changed our understanding of human nature forever. Their story teaches us that we are neither prisoners of our genetics nor solely products of our environment. We are both, in constant and complex interaction. Each experience shapes how our genes express themselves. Each gene influences how we respond to our experiences. For families facing mental illness today, the legacy of the quadruplets offers both hope and warning. Hope because it demonstrates that genetic vulnerabilities can be modified by environment and treatment. Warning because it shows how trauma and neglect can transform potential into tragedy. The Genin quadruplets can no longer speak for themselves, but their data, their carefully documented stories, continue to speak to us through decades of scientific research. They remind us that behind every psychiatric diagnosis is a person, behind every statistic is a life lived, and that scientific progress, however valuable, should never come at the expense of our shared humanity. If you could ask one question to the researchers who have dedicated their careers to studying Genin quadruples, what would it be? Leave it in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.